The hammer fell silent at dawn. For 17 years, the sound of Elijah's mallet had marked the rhythm of Belmont Plantation. Steady, precise, relentless as a heartbeat. On the morning of August 14, 1839, that rhythm stopped. The enslaved carpenter, known throughout Chatham County for his flawless joinery and unreadable silence, set down his tools in the workshop behind the main house. He walked past the magnolia grove, past the cotton fields still wet with dew, and stepped into the salt marshes that stretched toward the Atlantic. He was never seen again. 3 hours later, plantation owner Richard Belmont was discovered in his study. His body slumped forward over his desk, fingers still clutching a half-written letter. The cause of death was unclear. The letter was addressed to no one. And in the corner of the room, embedded deep into the mahogany floor, was a carpenter's chisel, one that had belonged to Elijah. What happened between those two events has haunted Savannah for nearly 2 centuries. This is not a ghost story. This is something more unsettling, a disappearance that defies explanation, and a truth that was buried in plain sight. Elijah's name appears only 11 times in the surviving records of Belmont Plantation. That fact alone should trouble us. Most enslaved craftsmen, especially those as skilled as Elijah, were documented extensively. Their labor was capital. Their abilities were advertised in newspapers, insured by underwriters, mentioned in wills and estate inventories. A master carpenter could be worth twice the value of a field hand. Yet Elijah exists in the historical record like a shadow, present, essential, but never fully visible. The first mention comes from a purchase ledger dated March 1822. Richard Belmont, a widower and minor tobacco planter, acquired one Negro man, Elijah, approximately 19 years of age, skilled in carpentry and cooperage, from an estate sale in Charleston. The price, $1,100, a significant sum for the time, indicating exceptional skill or rare training. Belmont had just inherited the plantation from his father and was rebuilding its operations after years of neglect. He needed someone who could construct everything from barn frames to furniture, from wagon wheels to window casements. Elijah was that person. What we know of Elijah's early life is almost nothing. No record of his birth. No mention of parents or siblings. No previous owner listed by name. The estate inventory from Charleston lists him only as trained in fine woodwork under German joiner. This detail is critical. German joiners were among the most sought-after craftsmen in the American South. Their techniques, dovetail joints without glue, mortise and tenon construction that required no nails, hand-planed surfaces smooth as glass, were considered superior to English or American methods. If Elijah had been trained in this tradition, he wasn't just a carpenter. He was an artist. And Richard Belmont knew it. Over the next 17 years, Elijah transformed Belmont Plantation. He built the main staircase, a spiraling masterpiece of yellow pine and black walnut that still stands in what is now a private residence outside Savannah. He constructed the plantation's cotton gin housing, the slave quarters, the smokehouse, the chapel, and a series of outbuildings whose quality attracted attention from neighboring planters. Every structure bore the same signature: flawless joinery, invisible seams, wooden pegs instead of iron nails, beams that interlocked like puzzle pieces. Visitors remarked on the quality. A letter from a neighboring planter named Gerald Stroud, dated October 1831, reads, "Belmont's Negro carpenter works with a precision I have seen only in Philadelphia. He does not speak, but his hands speak volumes. He does not speak." This phrase appears repeatedly in correspondence about Elijah. Not rarely speaks, or keeps quiet. Does not speak. Multiple accounts describe him as mute, or perhaps selectively silent. He communicated through gestures, through his work, and occasionally through written notes, though none of these notes survive. One overseer's journal entry from April 1835 mentions, Elijah left instruction on woodshed repair in chalk on slate. Followed it exactly. Held firm through storm. Elijah was not assigned to the fields. He did not live in the communal slave quarters with the other enslaved workers. He occupied a small workshop behind the main house, a space approximately 12 feet by 16 feet that he had built himself. He worked alone. He ate alone. And according to multiple accounts, he was never whipped, an almost unthinkable anomaly for an enslaved man in antebellum Georgia. Why? Some historians have suggested that Belmont feared damaging Elijah's hands, the source of his value. Others propose a mutual dependency. Elijah's labor was too valuable to risk, and punishing him might inspire sabotage or escape. But there's a third possibility, one hinted at in a cryptic diary entry from Belmont's cousin, Margaret Belmont Cruz, who visited the plantation in July 1837. She wrote, "Richard keeps that Carpenter close. Closer than sense allows. There is something in the man's eyes that unsettles me, not defiance, but knowledge. Richard will not speak of it, and when I pressed him on the matter, he turned cold and asked me to leave his study. I do not know what binds them, but it is not merely the bond of master and property." What did she see? By the summer of 1839, Belmont Plantation was thriving. The cotton yield was strong. The buildings were immaculate. And Elijah, now in his mid-30s, had become an institutional fixture, so embedded in the plantation's daily operations that his absence would have been unthinkable. Until the morning the hammer stopped. August 14, 1839, began like any other day at Belmont Plantation. The sky was pale and heavy with moisture. The enslaved field workers rose before dawn and moved through the cotton rows in silence, their hands already bleeding from the bowls by the time the sun broke over the tree-line. The kitchen house sent smoke curling into the humid air. The overseer, a man named Thaddeus Kroll, made his rounds on horseback, checking the irrigation ditches near the Ogeechee River. Everything was routine, except in the workshop. Elijah's hammer, a sound so constant it had become part of the plantation's auditory landscape, like birdsong or the creak of the mill wheel, was silent. At first, no one noticed. Kroll later testified in his deposition to the county magistrate that he assumed Elijah was working on interior joinery, perhaps installing cabinet hinges or planing table legs, tasks that required quieter tools. But by mid-morning, when Kroll passed the workshop to deliver instructions for a fence repair along the southern property line, he found the space empty. The tools were arranged neatly on the workbench. The wood shavings had been swept into a corner pile. A half-finished chair leg sat in the vise, its surface smooth and unfinished, the grain of the oak visible in the morning light. There was no sign of struggle. No indication of haste. No tool out of place. Elijah had simply walked away. Kroll's first instinct was not alarm but irritation. Enslaved workers who left their posts without permission were usually hiding to rest, visiting family in the quarters, or, in rare cases, attempting escape. All were offenses punishable by lash, shackles, or sale. He began a methodical search of the immediate grounds, the barn, the smokehouse, the spring house, the quarters. Nothing. He expanded the search to the fields, questioning other enslaved workers. No one had seen Elijah since the previous evening. By mid-morning, Kroll's irritation had turned to unease. Elijah had never disappeared before. He had never been disciplined. He had never shown any sign of rebellion or flight. His value to the plantation, and to Belmont personally, made his absence not just inconvenient but potentially catastrophic. It wasn't until nearly noon that someone thought to check the main house. Richard Belmont had not appeared for breakfast. This was unusual but not unprecedented. The planter occasionally worked late into the night on correspondence or account books and slept past dawn. But when the house cook, an enslaved woman named Patience, knocked on the study door to deliver his midday meal and received no answer, she hesitated. Then she entered. Richard Belmont was dead. He sat slumped at his writing desk near the window, his head resting on his left forearm, his right hand still gripping a quill. The ink had dried on the page in a dark smear where the pen had dragged across the paper. A half-written letter lay before him, its contents abrupt and unfinished. His face was pale, almost gray in the dim light filtering through the curtains. His lips were slightly parted. There were no visible wounds. No blood. No overturned furniture or shattered glass. No signs of struggle. Except for one detail. On the floor, approximately 6 feet from the desk, near the corner of the room beneath a bookshelf, a carpenter's chisel was embedded into the mahogany floorboards. Not lying flat. Not dropped. Embedded. Driven straight down with such force that the blade had pierced the wood nearly 2 inches deep, and the handle stood upright like a grave marker. The chisel belonged to Elijah. Kroll identified it immediately when he arrived moments later, summoned by Patience's screams. He recognized the wear pattern on the wooden handle, a smooth groove shaped by years of use, the way Elijah's thumb had rested against the grain. Within the hour, a rider was dispatched to Savannah. The county magistrate, a man named Howard Grist, arrived by late afternoon with a clerk and a physician. He examined the body, read the unfinished letter, and inspected the chisel embedded in the floor. His initial assessment was cautious. Possible natural death, possibly foul play. Belmont was 47 years old, in apparent good health. There was no poison suspected. The physician found no discoloration of the lips or tongue, no vomit, no convulsions described by witnesses. But there was also no clear medical cause. And then there was the chisel. Why, Grist wrote in his official report, would a tool be driven into the floor with such force unless in rage or ritual? And if the carpenter fled in guilt, why did no one hear the act? Why did no one see him leave? The letter provided no answers. It was short, written in Belmont's own hand, and addressed to no one. It read, "There are debts that cannot be paid in currency. There are walls built to conceal, and the man who built them now knows what lies within. I have lived as a coward lives, in comfort purchased by." The sentence ended there. The ink trailed off. Whatever Belmont had intended to confess, he never finished. By nightfall, a manhunt had begun. The contents of Richard Belmont's letter ignited immediate speculation. What debts? What walls? And most troubling, what did Elijah know? Magistrate Grist ordered the letter sealed as evidence, but word spread quickly through the county. Within days, rumors circulated in Savannah's taverns and parlors. Some claimed Belmont had been blackmailed. Others whispered that Elijah had discovered something, hidden money, forged documents, evidence of a crime, and murdered his master before fleeing. A few suggested the letter was a suicide note, that Belmont had driven the chisel into the floor himself in some final act of madness. But none of these theories explained the logistics. How had Elijah left the workshop, entered the house, killed or confronted Belmont, embedded the chisel with enough force to pierce 2 inches of hardwood, and then walked off the plantation without being seen or heard by anyone? The main house was surrounded by open ground. The study faced the front drive. Patience, the cook, had been in the kitchen house less than 50 yards away all morning. The field workers were scattered across the property but within sight lines of the house. No one saw him. No one heard anything. The only witness was Patience, and her testimony deepened the mystery. In her deposition to Magistrate Grist, recorded on August 16, 1839, she described the events of the previous night, the night before Belmont's body was discovered. She had been preparing the evening meal in the kitchen house when she heard raised voices coming from the main house. This was unusual. Belmont rarely entertained guests, and the overseer Kroll lived in a separate cottage on the property. Curious, she approached the main house and peered through the window of the study. She saw Belmont standing near his desk, his face red, his hand gesturing sharply. He was speaking, shouting, she said, but she could not make out the words through the glass. And standing across from him, near the door, was Elijah. Elijah was not moving. He was not speaking. He simply stood there, his arms at his sides, his face expressionless. Patience described it as a stillness like stone. Belmont continued shouting, pacing, pointing at Elijah, then at the desk, then at the walls. Finally, Belmont collapsed into his chair, his head in his hands. Elijah remained motionless. Then, according to Patience, something strange happened. Belmont looked up at Elijah and said something. She could not hear what, and Elijah turned and left the room. Not hurried. Not fearful. He simply walked out. Patience ducked back into the kitchen house, afraid of being caught spying. When she looked again a few minutes later, the study was dark. Belmont must have extinguished the lamps. But hours later, near midnight, Patience woke to the sound of footsteps on gravel. She looked out the window of her small room behind the kitchen house and saw a figure standing in the yard outside the study window. The moonlight was faint, but she recognized the silhouette. It was Elijah. He stood there for a long time, she estimated 10 minutes, maybe more, just staring into the darkened window of the study. He did not move. He did not knock. He simply stood there, watching. Then he turned and walked toward the marshlands. She heard the tall grass rustling. Then nothing. That was the last time anyone saw Elijah. When Grist pressed her on the details, what Elijah was wearing, whether he carried anything, whether he seemed agitated, Patience struggled to answer. She said he looked like a man already gone. When asked what she meant, she said, like he wasn't deciding to leave. Like he had already left, and his body was just catching up. The metaphor haunted Grist. He included it in his report, not as evidence but as a psychological observation. The witness speaks as one who has seen not a fugitive, but a ghost, he wrote. Whether this reflects the truth of what she saw or the superstition of her condition, I cannot say. But Patience's testimony did one thing. It confirmed that Elijah and Belmont had spoken the night before the death. It confirmed that something had passed between them, some confrontation, some revelation. And it confirmed that Elijah had returned to the house one final time, in the dead of night, to look through the window. What did he see? What did he know? And why, after 17 years of silence, had everything unraveled in a single night? The manhunt for Elijah began at first light on August 15, 1839. Thaddeus Kroll organized a search party of 12 men, local planters, hired slave catchers, and a pack of bloodhounds brought in from a neighboring county. The dogs were given Elijah's work apron to scent, a piece of leather stained with sweat and wood dust. Within minutes, they picked up the trail leading south from the plantation toward the salt marshes that bordered the Ogeechee River. The marshlands of coastal Georgia are among the most treacherous environments in the American South. A vast, shifting labyrinth of tidal creeks, spartina grass, oyster beds, and mud flats that flood twice daily with the Atlantic tide. The water is brackish and dark, stained brown by tannins from the cypress swamps upstream. Alligators nest in the shallows. Cottonmouths coil on half-submerged logs. The air hums with mosquitoes. And the ground, if it can be called ground, is a sucking mire that can swallow a man to his waist in seconds. It is not a place where anyone, enslaved or free, would choose to flee. And yet the dogs led the search party directly into its heart. For 3 days, they searched. The bloodhounds followed the scent for nearly a mile before losing it at the edge of a tidal creek. The handlers waded into the water, hoping to pick up the trail on the opposite bank, but the dogs circled uselessly. The scent had vanished. Kroll assumed Elijah had waded downstream to throw off the dogs, a common tactic among fugitives, and ordered the party to spread out along the creek, searching both banks for footprints, broken vegetation, or any sign of passage. They found nothing. On the second day, they expanded the search to the deeper marsh. The men moved in a line, probing the mud with poles, checking abandoned fishing shacks and oyster camps that dotted the coastline. The heat was oppressive. The insects were relentless. Several men suffered cuts from the razor-sharp marsh grass. One nearly stepped on a water moccasin and had to be pulled back by his companions. But there was no sign of Elijah. Slave catchers were experienced trackers. They knew how to read broken branches, disturbed mud, the faint impressions of bare feet on soft ground. But the marsh revealed nothing. It was as if Elijah had walked into the water and dissolved. By the third day, the search party was exhausted and demoralized. Kroll began to accept the possibility that Elijah had drowned, either intentionally, to escape capture, or accidentally, lost in the maze of channels and quicksand bogs. Several men suggested calling off the search. The cost of the manhunt, the hired trackers, the dogs, the lost labor hours, was mounting. And then, Late in the afternoon of August 17th, one of the searchers made a discovery. Approximately 2 miles into the marsh, near a stand of ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss, a piece of fabric was found snagged on a low-hanging cypress branch. It was Elijah's work apron, the same one the dogs had been given to track. The leather was damp but intact. There was no blood on it. No tears. It had been placed on the branch deliberately, not torn off in a struggle. But here's what made the discovery so unsettling. There were no footprints leading to the tree. No marks in the mud. No disturbed vegetation. The ground around the cypress was soft and wet, perfect for holding tracks. Yet there was nothing. The searchers stood in silence, staring at the apron. One of them, a planter named William Hoke, later wrote in a letter to a friend, "It was as if the man had been lifted by invisible hands and set down in that spot, then lifted again and carried away. I am not a superstitious man, but I confess the sight chilled me." Kroll ordered the search to continue for another day, but the men were spooked. They moved slowly, reluctantly, casting glances over their shoulders. By nightfall, they had found nothing else. No body. No clothing. No tools. No evidence that Elijah had passed through the area at all, except for that single apron, hanging like a message. On August 18th, Magistrate Grist officially suspended the search. In his report, he wrote, "After 4 days of extensive search by trained men and hounds, no trace of the fugitive Elijah has been found save one article of clothing, inexplicably located in terrain where no man could have traveled without leaving sign. It is the opinion of this office that the subject either perished in the marshlands, his body consumed by wildlife or swept out to sea by the tide, or escaped by means unknown and extraordinary. The case remains open but suspended pending new evidence." No new evidence ever came. Elijah had vanished. But the story was far from over. 3 weeks after Richard Belmont's death, his estate went into probate. The plantation, valued at approximately $18,000 including land, buildings, livestock, and enslaved people, was to be settled by his only surviving relative, his cousin Margaret Belmont Cruz, the same woman who had visited the plantation 2 years earlier and written uneasily about Elijah in her diary. Margaret arrived in September 1839 to oversee the inventory. She brought with her an attorney, a clerk, and a deep sense of foreboding. In a letter to her husband, she wrote, "I do not wish to be here. The house feels wrong. The silence is too heavy. I see Richard in every shadow." The inventory process was routine at first. The enslaved people were appraised and listed. The livestock counted. The cotton gin and outbuildings inspected. But when the assessors entered the study, the room where Belmont's body had been found, they noticed something. The chisel was still embedded in the floor. No one had removed it. Kroll had left it as evidence, assuming the magistrate might want to examine it again. But now, weeks later, it stood like a monument in the corner of the room, its handle slightly tilted, the wood around it warped from moisture. Margaret ordered it removed. 2 men tried to pull it free. It would not budge. They used a pry bar. The wood splintered, but the chisel remained fixed. Finally, one of the men suggested cutting around it, removing the entire section of floorboard. When they did, they discovered something. Beneath the floorboards, in a hollow space approximately 2 feet square, was a leather-bound ledger. The ledger was wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. When Margaret opened it, her hands began to shake. The book contained 17 years of entries, all in Richard Belmont's handwriting, documenting transactions that had never been reported to tax authorities, probate courts, or family members. The ledger revealed a secret trade. Belmont had been selling enslaved people, quietly, privately, often to buyers in other states, without recording the sales in his official account books. Between 1822 and 1839, he had sold at least 23 individuals, many of them children separated from their parents. The sales were conducted through intermediaries, often at night, with no bills of sale or legal documentation. The money, totaling more than $12,000, had been hidden in various locations on the property, including inside the walls of buildings. And the ledger revealed something else. Elijah had built those hiding places. Several entries referenced constructing concealment compartment in study wall, and false floor in smokehouse, and hidden panel behind bookshelf. Elijah had been forced to build the infrastructure of Belmont's crimes. Secret spaces where money, documents, and even people waiting to be sold were hidden from view. He had been the architect of his master's deception. But why had the ledger been hidden beneath the floorboards in that exact spot? Why had the chisel been driven down with such precision? Margaret's attorney, a man named Charles Whitmore, proposed a theory. He believed Elijah had known about the ledger. Perhaps he had seen Belmont hide it. Perhaps he had been ordered to build the compartment himself. And on the night of August 13th, during the confrontation patients witnessed, Elijah had demanded his freedom in exchange for his silence. Belmont had refused. So Elijah had left a message. The chisel, driven into the floor, marked the exact location of the evidence that could destroy Belmont's reputation and unravel his estate. It was not an act of violence. It was an act of revelation. Whether Belmont died of shock, heart failure, or something else, we will never know. But the physician's report noted one detail. Belmont's face in death had an expression described as acute terror. What had he seen in those final moments? Had Elijah returned to the window at midnight not to threaten, but to watch? Had Belmont, alone in his study, realized that the man he had enslaved for 17 years, the man who had built his walls, his floors, his hiding places, had just turned those structures into a trap? The ledger became public record during the probate proceedings. The scandal rippled through Savannah's planter class. Several buyers named in the ledger were investigated. Some reputations were destroyed. Margaret sold the plantation at a loss and returned to Charleston, vowing never to speak of the matter again. But one question remained. Where was Elijah? In the years following Elijah's disappearance, historians, journalists, and amateur investigators have constructed various theories about what happened on the night of August 13, 1839. The most common theory is straightforward. Elijah murdered Belmont, fled into the marsh, and died there, either by drowning, exposure, or animal attack. His body was never recovered because the tidal marshes are unforgiving. Alligators and crabs would have consumed soft tissue within days. Bones would have been scattered or buried in silt. This theory is plausible and aligns with the known facts. But it doesn't explain the chisel. If Elijah had killed Belmont in a moment of rage or desperation, why take the time to drive a chisel into the floor with enough force to pierce 2 inches of hardwood? Why not simply flee? And if he intended the chisel as a message, why would he risk the extra minutes in the house when discovery could mean immediate execution? A second theory, proposed by legal historians, suggests that Belmont's death was not murder but a medical event, a heart attack or stroke brought on by the confrontation with Elijah. In this version, Elijah confronted Belmont with knowledge of the ledger, demanded freedom or threatened exposure, and Belmont collapsed from the stress. Elijah, realizing he would be blamed regardless, embedded the chisel as evidence and fled. This theory is emotionally compelling. It casts Elijah not as a murderer but as a man taking one final act of agency, marking the truth for others to find, even if he could not benefit from it himself. But there's a third theory, one that is more speculative but haunting in its implications. What if Elijah never touched Richard Belmont at all? Consider the timeline. Patience saw them argue the night before. She saw Elijah leave the study calmly. Hours later, she saw Elijah standing outside the study window, staring in. Then he walked toward the marsh. By dawn, he was gone. By noon, Belmont was found dead. What if Elijah had already decided to leave? What if the confrontation was not a demand but a farewell, a final revelation that Belmont's secrets were no longer safe? What if Elijah embedded the chisel earlier, perhaps days or weeks before, and simply waited for the right moment to disappear? And what if Belmont, alone in his study that night, staring at the chisel driven into his floor, realized what it meant? What if the terror that killed him was not physical but psychological? The sudden understanding that the man he had enslaved, the man who had built every wall and floor and hidden compartment in his house, had left behind a trap that would outlive them both. In this version, Elijah's last act was not violence but architecture. He built his freedom the way he built everything else, with precision, patience, and an understanding of structure that went deeper than wood and nails. He constructed his escape not as a flight but as a plan, one that began long before that final night, and one that ensured Richard Belmont would be haunted not by a ghost, but by the truth. We will never know for certain. The historical record is incomplete. Belmont's autopsy was cursory. The chisel was eventually discarded. The ledger was sealed in a courthouse archive and later destroyed in a fire during the Civil War. But what we do know is this. Elijah, a man who lived in silence for 17 years, left behind a message so clear that it echoes across nearly 2 centuries. He knew what you did. He built the walls that hid it. And when he left, he made sure those walls would speak. Elijah was never found. No body was recovered from the marsh. No capture was recorded in Georgia or South Carolina. No sale or re-enslavement appeared in any registry. For all official purposes, Elijah ceased to exist on the morning of August 14, 1839. But the stories did not stop. In the years following his disappearance, reports began to surface. Quiet rumors passed among enslaved communities, whispered in kitchens and workshops, carried along the network of safe houses and secret routes that would later be known as the Underground Railroad. A black carpenter, they said, had been seen in the coastal regions of Georgia and South Carolina. He appeared without warning, always alone, and offered his services to freed families, fugitive settlements, and remote communities of Gullah people living in the Sea Islands. He built homes, repaired churches, constructed fishing boats. His work was flawless. He never asked for payment. And he never spoke. In 1851, a Gullah elder in Beaufort told an interviewer about a silent builder who had helped construct a schoolhouse for freed children. He worked like a man with a debt to pay, she said. But not to us. To someone already gone. In 1863, during the Civil War, a Union officer stationed on Hilton Head Island recorded an encounter with an elderly black man repairing a dock. He must have been 60 or older, the officer wrote. His hands were gnarled but steady. When I asked if he was enslaved, he shook his head. When I asked if he was free, he smiled and pointed to the water. And then, in 1870, a census taker in Liberty County, Georgia, recorded an entry that has puzzled researchers for decades. In a small freedmen's settlement near the coast, the census lists Elijah, Negro, male, carpenter, age unknown. No last name. No birthplace. No family listed. Just Elijah Carpenter, age unknown. The settlement was located less than 15 miles from the site of the old Belmont plantation. Was it him? Or simply another man who shared the name? We will never know. The census taker did not record additional details. No photograph exists. No interview was conducted. By the next census in 1880, the entry was gone. But if it was him, if Elijah survived the marsh, lived in hiding for 31 years, and eventually returned to the land where he had been enslaved, then his story is not one of escape, but of transformation. He did not run to freedom. He built it. Slowly, carefully, one joint at a time. He became a man who could not be owned because he refused to stay visible long enough to be captured. He moved through the South like water through wood, shaping it, supporting it, and then vanishing into the grain. And perhaps that is the real reason he was never found. Not because he died in the marsh. Not because he fled to the north. But because he understood something fundamental about freedom. It is not a place you reach. It is a structure you build. One that must be strong enough to stand on its own, invisible enough to escape notice, and resilient enough to outlast those who would tear it down. There is a photograph in the Georgia Historical Society archives. It is dated 1879 and shows the remains of Belmont Plantation, a crumbling chimney, collapsed outbuildings, fields overtaken by kudzu. But in the background, still standing, is the main staircase Elijah built. The spiral of yellow pine and black walnut, interlocked without nails, weathered but unbroken. It is still there today. The house has been restored and converted into a private residence. The owners are unaware of the full story. But the staircase remains, and if you run your hand along the banister, you can still feel the smoothness of the wood, planed by hand, shaped with precision, built to last. Elijah's labor outlived his master. His work outlived the institution that enslaved him. And his disappearance became an act of authorship, a refusal to let history write his ending. Most enslaved people were erased from the record. Their names were lost. Their stories were silenced. But Elijah left evidence. Buildings that still stand. A chisel that pointed to truth. And a vanishing so complete that it became its own kind of monument. In the end, perhaps that was his final act of craftsmanship. To build a life that could not be captured, a freedom that could not be sold, and a silence that spoke louder than any testimony. The marshlands of coastal Georgia are still there. At dawn, the line between earth and water disappears. The reeds sway in the wind. The tide rises and falls. And somewhere in that liminal space, between what is remembered and what is forgotten, between what was taken and what was reclaimed, a man once stepped out of history and into legend. His name was Elijah. And he built his own ending.